there's two things that the speaking industry can do. And the first is more straightforward, which is using the metaverse to host events, to host conferences, to host speakers. And what that does is it allows for a greater diversity of speakers, and it allows for greater engagement. So during COVID, we saw a lot of Zoom speaking and everything was digital, and that was okay, but it felt very one directional, right? I did a panel a couple of years ago, a great panel. One of my dearest friends and I were doing it together. We had a moderator that was fantastic. It was an amazing conversation. I had so much fun. And then I was on Zoom because it was during COVID and there were no in-person conferences. And I remember the Zoom call finished and I hung up and I just sat there and I thought, okay, that's over now. I can't go talk to people. I can't interact with the audience. My husband knocked on the door a few minutes later and said, hey, can you go walk the dog? And it was just really deflating and kind of demoralizing. Whereas in the metaverse, when you're speaking, you can interact with people. You can interact with avatars. You can network and socialize afterwards, right? The stuff that we all love doing. And what that does is it opens it up to other types of speakers who can't travel as much because they have disabilities or family commitments, or they live in markets where it's hard to get a travel visa, or they just don't feel like spending 16 hours on an airplane to go and talk for an hour, right? It opens things up in a really, really meaningful way. And it allows people from all over the world to come and co-create. And that's really important, especially as we think about the environmental impacts of travel, or just, allowing broader groups of people to come in and be part of events who might not be able to afford to travel, or who have, like you said before, the family commitments. So that's sort of the biggest win. I think a second win, and a sort of more esoteric one, is that the metaverse can really provide what is kind of like a blind audition. So in orchestras, for example, you don't see who's playing when they're auditioning. They're behind a curtain. So all you are judging them on is the quality of their work, their instrumentation, their playing. There was a fascinating project a couple of years ago where a company said, okay, we're going to do this experiment. They, came up with a problem, and they picked 10 people from the company, from the C-suite all the way down to interns. Everyone was randomly assigned a number, and everyone was randomly given an avatar, and all the avatars were very funny. I think they were all like pink rabbits or something very silly. And everyone's voice was disguised. So it looked absurd. You sounded like you were in witness protection. You looked like a pink rabbit. You had a number floating over your head, and everyone got together to solve this problem. And what happened was the interns weren't afraid to speak up. They didn't know who else was in there. So for them, they could shout out ideas. They could be really involved. They weren't intimidated. They weren't afraid. The C-suite got to hear from a diversity of opinions and backgrounds rather than people sort of holding back because they were afraid the boss would get mad at them. And everyone had a fantastic experience. It was this kind of shocking reveal at the end when, like, this 23-year-old kid who just started working there was the one who came up with the best solution. And the CEO was like, oh, this is amazing. And so I think that can be sort of, brought forward into other things. So, there's a lot of bias right now in the world. That's just how, unfortunately, it is. So if you are doing speaker auditions and you just want to understand, okay, who is actually the most informed on this topic, who has the most interesting stuff to say, that's a way to remove some of that bias. Same for job interviews, same for a lot of different things. So that's an interesting and a little bit more esoteric use case. But I do think the speaking industry, if they really are committed to diverse voices, could invest in doing something like that.